how do we form something like a healthy nationalism based on something like a positive view of the nation without confounding historical fact and oversimplifying things?
You don't. That's a mad enterprise. I mean, that's the sort of thing that do you know, when I was a PhD student or when I was an academic, you'd sit there in seminars and people with furrowed brows would say, "Gosh, it's so terrible that the public believe all these myths, isn't it? What a shame. How can we educate them out of it?" And even then I used to think, you're demented. Like, the public want to believe this stuff. They don't want to sit around in a history seminar and be lectured by some pedant about what actually happened in 1940. So the idea that, any nation's story, a nation's nothing if not a story. A narrative is central to a country's sense of itself. A shared national narrative is absolutely at the core of what it is to be patriotic, or, you use the word nationalism, let's say patriotism. Inevitably, that will end up sort of being centered around a series of comforting myths, if you like. So in France, it's the Revolution. In Britain, it's probably the summer of 1940, Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain, and so on. In the United States, it's the American Revolution or Abraham Lincoln or something. All countries have them. And I don't think they are unhealthy. I think they're completely healthy, in the same way that you as an individual have myths about yourself, or your family has stories that you tell that are simplified, comforting family anecdotes or whatever, or a sense of yourselves, or a couple will have a kind of founding myth of how they got together and blah, 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 in which all the sort of complications and the rows have been magically smoothed out, right? That's just completely normal. That is healthy. That's how human beings function. So I don't personally have a problem with the fact that, for example, I think it's completely natural and healthy that people in Britain think, they stood alone in 1940, that Dunkirk happened in the back. I think as national myths going, that's not a very pernicious one. The French Revolution, there's a lot of bloodshed, a lot of people died in the terror, all the rest of it. When I look at Bastille Day, am I seething and thinking, I'd love to go over there and give them a good talking to? No, of course not. Because I think that's completely natural and normal that people have these founding myths. I think where a myth can become pernicious is when it curdles into a sense of victimhood, or where it relies on the demonization of somebody else. A lot of nationalisms do have that at their core. You look at the Balkans, for example. A lot of relatively new states, and at the center of their sense of themselves is often a sense that they basically had to fight for their independence against the people next door, who were uniquely terrible and would probably like to kill them again if they had the chance. And that obviously can be very unhealthy. But by and large, the example you give, for example, of the French Revolution and as a founding myth, or Joan of Arc might be another one. I don't think those are unhealthy at all. And I think moaning and groaning that they don't match what scholarly historians think happened in the past is a sort of misunderstanding of what the point of them is.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting way of thinking about it. I grew up I am Maltese and grew up in Malta. So, the 1565 Great Siege in Malta is something that's drilled into you as a child. And that's something in the national conscience, and it's taught to us as a historic point, not only for Malta, but for Europe as a whole. So it's quite interesting in that sense, regardless of how true it maybe is, however you want to understand the word true. The question I had is very related to that. It's related to education and how something is taught. This is something that Reform UK have been talking about as well a lot, is how do we teach, for example, British history to students, and both the good things, but also the bad things that, for example, the British Empire did. What's your opinion on that? The British Empire and colonialism is, to some extent, part of the national myth in Britain. But there is, of course, so much about it that is negative.
Mm-hmm.
How do you break that down, and how should it be taught? Should we teach young kids the negative aspects of British history in such a strong sense?
Well, first of all, I don't really divide history into positive and negative. I think that's very sort of a slight, dare I say, I'm not saying it of you, of course, but I think it's a slightly simplistic way of looking at it.
For sure.
So I think the sort of what people call the balance sheet, I wouldn't necessarily do that. Uh, I think, would I teach the British Empire? I mean, I think teachers can teach what they like, actually. I mean, there's an awful lot of British history, and I don't think governments should be prescriptive about it, not least because often in a lot of schools, the one thing that nobody ever talks about, really, with regard to schools and the teaching of history, is that in a lot of schools, children only do 2 45-minute or 40-minute hours, periods of history a week. So there's very little you can get through. And to say, well, I think they should do the whole sweep of British history is crazy. There's no way you can possibly get through all of that and do it justice in that amount of time. So you have to pick and choose. Clearly, the British Empire is a fascinating subject, really important subject. I think doing it with a moralizing or finger wagging one way or the other is frankly boring for children as much as it probably is quite boring for the teachers. I think I actually never think this is as complicated as other people seem to think.
Right.
I just think you just say what happened, tell the whole story. I mean, kids love the violence, why not put that in? Everybody loves people being fired out of cannons. That's brilliant. Put it in.
I guess what I meant, and just to clarify, it's not always possible to tell the whole story, right? So that's the job of a historian, as you of course know, you need to leave some bits out. So I think part of what, for example, Reform UK might say is we're teaching too much the negative aspects of British history. We should be more proud rather than criticize the fact that Britain colonized so many countries and took their slaves and so on.
It's a good question. And it's a fair question because, of course, you're right that what you choose, you have to make choices. Personally, I think clearly you have to have a fair bit of balance, and it would be irresponsible not to. And I think you can, for example, tell the story of the British Empire and say, this happened and this was, very kindly. This happened and it involved, shooting loads of people. You can you want to give what you honestly think is a fair portrait, I guess. I mean, I'm thinking about like when I've done children's books, which I do a history series for children. You don't want to just tell them something that's madly partisan and biased, because I think then you're cheating them in some way if you don't allow them to glimpse the sort of the capaciousness of the past. I think if your national teaching of history does not, at some basic level, inculcate some sense of belonging,
Pride.
Yeah, a degree of pride. I mean, the thing is, I don't want to, I was hesitant to say pride because I didn't want to sound like I was the Reform UK education spokesman. However, I think it is weird if you have a national education system that doesn't make people feel, I mean, basically, ideally, to be a healthy country, you want people to be quite proud to belong to that country. And so, for example, my wife is Irish. The Irish education system, I think it does make people feel proud to be Irish, and quite right too. The American education system makes people very proud to be American. I don't think that's unhealthy. I think that's normal and natural. It's like, to give the analogy, if a nation is an extended family, it's pretty weird to bring someone up in your family and to not make them feel pleased to be part of it and to feel a sense of belonging and a sense of commitment to it. And so I think if you're part of a nation, you want to feel quite proud to belong to that nation. So I don't think it's unhealthy or unnatural for a British education system to hope that at the end of the story, at the end of the process, people will come out and they'll be pleased to be British and they'll see the good in it. I think that is perfectly compatible with saying, the slave trade was horrible and we, were prime movers in it, for example. I mean, I don't think because I think children are much more, I think there's sometimes a slightly condescending attitude towards the intelligence of children that's taken by campaigners on this issue. They can only cope with one thing in their head at a time. Whereas actually, having done loads of school talks and having written for children, I mean, children are obviously far more intelligent generally than adults because they haven't made up their minds about things. And they're perfectly capable of having multiple things going on in their head at once. To say of somebody, well, Winston Churchill was a great fellow in all the kinds of ways, but he had feet of clay and he wasn't perfect. I mean, a 10-year-old can completely get their head around that. They have no problem with that. So the idea that it's all pride or all shame, I think, is bonkers.
Just to stretch your analogy though about the family as a model for the nation, right? And you say it would be weird to grow up in a family, and they say, well, this family's horrible. I don't want to stretch the metaphor too far, but if you grow up in an abusive family, right, it might actually be problematic to be told that you're growing up in a great family from the beginning. And so despite you not being, generally I think you have quite an anti-moralist approach to history, right? Like you don't want us to draw lessons too strongly. And yet my fear with the aim of cultivating national pride is that it can end up leading to you doing that sort of thing implicitly, can't it?
What, that you are in an abusive relationship with your country and you need
Or
to...
you can be. I don't want to
can
talk
be.
for every country or for every family, right? But as an aim, I think it's going to lead to a partisan reading of history, right? Because you're going into it with the aim to come out with a certain viewpoint about something.
Yeah, but what's the alternative? The alternative is that you're suggesting that there is a perfectly neutral way of interpreting history that is from an inverted commas objective standpoint, that stands outside any hint of taint or bias or whatever. And I don't believe there can ever be such a thing.
Shouldn't the emphasis then be on, let's say, for example, bringing an issue like, let's just stick on the empire because I think that makes it easy, right? Bringing the British Empire, for example, and being like, okay, what are we going to think about this by the end of the lesson? Or what are we going to think about this by the end of the 2 weeks? And encourage children to construct the narratives themselves.
Yeah, completely. I think you would. I think ideally, if I was a teacher, I would want them to believe that they'd come to their own opinion and they'd form their own opinion, but actually that opinion was my opinion. That's the thing. That's what I would aim for. No, I think clearly you need to listen. I think a fair-minded way of approaching this is to say you want children to think for themselves. They can come to a variety of different opinions and they will reflect their own personal approach to a subject.